Police officers of Reddit, what are some laws that you feel uncomfortable enforcing because you disagree with them? When I was a parking officer, there was an internal policy about not ticketing cars parked in this very wealthy neighborhood even if it was clearly an unsafe violation. They would park their trailers or small boats very close to intersections, and that made it dangerous to navigate around there. Because there were too many bigwigs, we could have risked our jobs if we ticketed someone there, so they decided to not have the parking officers enforce it. Edit. Thanks for my first silver kind stranger. Now I want to address a couple things. 1. My superiors expressed distaste for this policy when telling us about this, so they felt no pleasure this rule. This has more to do with certain elected officials than the police in this case. 2. I know a lot of people want me to leak this, but I have no substantial evidence to leak something so off the books for a local news source. We were only told this verbally once. Plus, confidentiality would be a concern due to the small amount of people that are hired for this job and could likely be easily guessed on via process of elimination. Traffic tickets. I'd pull people over, give a verbal warning about whatever dumb or unsafe thing they just did, check for warrants and let them go. I got funny looks for the blank spot in my work card where the tickets were supposed to go, but since it's illegal to officially or unofficially have a quota system, it could never be used against me in my job evaluation. Ex-police officer here in the US. The two that stand out the most is how much officer discretion is used in each scenario for someone to go to jail. Could be the same person with the same amount of illegal substance. I could destroy the evidence and send them away, or I could take them to jail. Up to the officer. The second would be the ability to ticket each window as illegal tint instead of one just for the car. Arresting homeless people. We usually just bring them in but forget to file paperwork on them, so they get a warm bed, a breakfast, and no record. So here is one that bugs me. John leaves the bar feeling okay, gets in the car and starts to drive home. During the drive he realizes that he's drunker than he thought, or his BAC is still ramping up from his last drink. Yes, you can be drunker a half hour after leaving a bar. He makes a decision to not drive the rest of the way home and pulls off the road at a rest stop or a parking lot, puts the car in park, turns off the headlights but leaves it running to listen to the radio, run the heat or AC, whatever, moves the seat back and starts sleeping it off a little. At that point he is not driving while intoxicated, he did drive while intoxicated but realized he was impaired and stopped. Maybe a pie if he's obnoxious or was obviously severely impaired. I argued with my instructor about this. The goal is to not have drunks on the road. The drunk got off the road on his own. If we pop those people for DWI, the lesson learned and retold to all of their drunk friends is, if you start to drive drunk, don't stop, keep driving, all the way home. Of course it's ideal if they Uber or have a DD, take a cab or public transport, but I'd rather have people who went a little overboard comfortable with the idea of getting off the damned road as soon as they realize it than thinking they have to make it all the way home or get a DWI. Then they hit some family car with a baby in the car seat. Prior to legalization here in Canada, my city for years had a marijuana-related arrest rate almost 70% lower than the national average. This is in a college town where students make up 20% of the population, so it's not like there wasn't a lot of it in town. There wasn't any policy or directive regarding marijuana issued. It was just a result of all officers personally turning a blind eye to pot unless the citizen was being a jerk. Back in my Leo career days, I was always very uncomfortable with using dogs to search for drugs. Yeah, they really can sniff out drugs, but the false positive accuracy is so far out of whack with what should be a legal standard for reasonable suspicion that it's little better than guessing. If a dog hits on 100 cars, and 50% of them have no drugs in them, you just violated the civil rights of 50 people based on what a dog said. Dogs aren't people, you can't interview or cross-examine them in court. It's not a specified law as such, but in the UK people can use reasonable force to protect themselves, others and property etc. Obviously everyone has their own interpretation of what reasonable force is, but I remember going to one job where a bloke was sat on his couch with a beer watching TV when a drunk bloke has just walked straight into his living room via the front door. A confrontation ensued and the drunk trespasser had become aggressive and a fight ensued. Long story short, the trespasser was given a proper shoe-in. So much so he's ended up in the street where he has then called the police. We attended and his injuries were substantial enough that the house occupant was arrested for grievous bodily harm, GBH, and it most definitely rubbed me up the wrong way in being involved in that job because I totally sympathized with the guy and felt any of us would have probably done the same thing if we were in his position. Driving while impaired with resulting grievous injury or death. There's a statute on the books where I works that prohibits any amount of Schedule 1 drugs in your bloodstream while operating a vehicle. Marijuana is still illegal here and is still classed as a Schedule 1 drug, by state law. If you are unaware, the byproducts of marijuana use can be detected in your blood weeks after your high has passed. That means that you could legally smoke marijuana in any one of several nearby states where it is completely legal to do so, wait a few weeks, come to my shithole state, get crashed into while stopped at a red light with the other driver completely at fault, pass the field sobriety test with flying colors, then get banged for our version of driving while impaired with resulting grievous injury or death. I didn't actually know the marijuana provision of the per SEDWI statute when I joined the county-wide crash team as an evaluator. Someone told me a story about a guy they'd done who been completely faultless in an accident wherein 2 people had died and had admitted to smoking marijuana a few weeks earlier. That had formed the basis for a search warrant and he was convicted of the felony based on the blood work. I started advising unimpaired, faultless drivers of the marijuana provision. The attorneys told me to stop, so I quit the team. I'm not a police officer. I'm a CPS agent. I'm uncomfortable with allowing children to stay in homes that don't have water and electricity as long as they have a source of water and a place to bathe. Schools and relatives turn to me and say, "Why aren't you helping?" Because I can't. It's the law. Not a cop, but my buddy is. He absolutely hates pulling traffic stops and giving tickets unless the person is doing something super reckless. He thinks for the most part they're useless and add to the community's dislike of police. Not to mention they're statistically pretty dangerous for him. My friend is a cop in an area with real gang violence and other issues. Chief got up for the daily briefing and told them they needed to prioritize reducing recycling theft, which was homeless people digging through recycle bins to get CRV items. I'm not a cop anymore, but I rarely arrested for personal use marijuana. It's a harmless plant. Selling is a different story, because most of those dealers are supporting a cartel or a higher crime, and I don't agree with that. There was one case, where a bunch of guys in my agency would have arrested in a heartbeat, and honestly, by law I was required to investigate, but didn't. A car drove through the back of someone's house because the driver confused the brake and gas pedal. The house that was driven through had a lone marijuana plant in another room, which is a felony in my state, and growers get shit on in my state. I stepped in front of it so the firefighters and others wouldn't notice and raise hell about it. This homeowner was a good old boy, and a church-going father who worked a nice job and contributed greatly to society. I'm not trying to ruin his family's life over a plant. When I walked out of the house and came back in, the plant was missing. He was probably shitting bricks the whole time I stood there. Now that I'm not a cop, I thought about leaving a letter in his mailbox telling him I knew about the plant, but I don't want to make him paranoid, lol. Where I work there is a statute prohibiting leaving your car running unattended. It is called no puffing laws. This is very popular during the winter time because nobody likes to freeze while their car is warming up. However, doing this makes your car more likely to get stolen. It's our policy that if an individual reports their car being stolen because they left it running, they will be ticketed. It basically penalizes the victim of a crime. Weed laws. Unless you are a distributor, I don't care. Also don't care about doing traffic stops. Last one I did was in March. Not a police officer, but still technically law enforcement at the time. When I was in the Coast Guard, I did a lot of drug and migrant interdiction down in the Caribbean. Chasing drug smugglers was pretty fun, but interdicting the migrants was always sad. We would usually find Haitians or Cubans, and the Haitians were always much worse off. It was pretty heartbreaking having to send them back after seeing the state they were in, and the state of country they were trying to leave. They would go through such great lengths to leave and we had to stop them. One guy tried to light himself on fire and others would try and injure themselves to try and get us to take them to U.S. healthcare facilities. The only redeeming thing about interdicting them was their ships were always very shoddily made, and oftentimes our act of interdicting them was also us saving them from a sinking ship. In my college town there were really only 4 bars within walking distance to campus, and they were all notoriously lax on their ID policy. Any fake got you in the door, and sometimes you didn't even need that. But the cops always kept their distance because that meant students were drinking under the regulation of bouncers and bartenders, which was obviously preferable to the alternative of constantly throwing house parties. I was a seasonal park ranger over the 2019 summer. I went into the job thinking that I'd be doing more rangery things. You know, wildlife, information, etc. Instead I quickly learned that park rangers are on the same level as state troopers, and that us seasonals were the grunts enforcing the other laws that the full-time rangers were too busy to handle. The park I worked at was built in the 80s, so the campgrounds and whatnot were exceptionally small by modern-day standards. Some things I hated enforcing and would turn a blind eye as much as possible. Keeping your vehicle parked on the asphalt. This one was rough because of how big campers are now, and how small our sites were. Sometimes you just had to squeeze onto the grass a little bit so everything fit. I usually gave these people a heads up that the other rangers might contact them for it. Keep your dog on a leash at all times. God, I hated this rule. I'm a dog person, and if I saw people with their dog off-leash running around in a field by themselves, I would leave it. The entire season there was only one instance when an off-leash dog got aggressive, and that's because the owner was drinking and got into a physical altercation with another park goer and the dog was trying to protect his master. No hammocks in the trees. What? Seriously? You can't hang a hammock here? The reasoning was that hammocks damaged the trees. Okay, maybe the ones with the hooks do, but I literally never saw those the entire season. Bonus bullshit rule. The park manager, a well-known ranger in the agency, along with some of the other full-timers, would actively encourage us to pull people over on the lake while we were in the patrol boat for the slightest infraction, and then perform a safety check on their vessel and harp on every little thing that they might be missing. It was expected that we would issue double, if not triple, the amount of tickets than the rangers on land while we were on the water. Most people do not break the law. Bonus. Some other rangers rescued a lady from drowning while on the boat. I was on land with the family. The park manager arrived and told me to issue the lady a ticket for swimming in an undesignated area. I was pissed, the family was pissed, and then when the father of the lady came up to thank me for our service of getting his daughter out of the water, the park manager immediately got in between me and the guy and got very aggressive with him. It was mind-blowing. Suffice to say, I was the ranger that wrote the least amount of tickets that season, but I also had the best rapport with most of the people I interacted with. Surprise, surprise. People like you better if you talk to them beforehand if you notice them doing something wrong as opposed to watching them break that law and then ticket them for it. And hashtag X200B. Edit. I should clarify the dog rule. Yeah, if the dog was being an issue I'd take care of it. But most of the dogs that were off-leash were those that were playing in the lake or running in a nearby field pretty much to themselves. Those that were off-leash around other people and such that I talked to were, more often than not, pretty well behaved. For every time I turned a blind there was probably another 3 times that I would have to intervene. I was pretty on top of it for a while, but once I got to know the regulars and see how the park would move and how different dogs were behaving, I got pretty relaxed, perhaps overconfident. Not an officer but criminal defense attorney. Driving while license revoked tickets are an absolute racket in North Carolina and savvy cops have realized they don't care to enforce it. Basically what happens is a lower income person gets a traffic ticket for speeding or whatever. The judge will give them up to 30 days to pay the ticket after the court date. However, because the fines are generally $213 to $263, a lot of lower income people cannot afford to pay the ticket. So, once the time to pay expires, the DMV revokes their license. Then, someone will get pulled over for having a revoked license. At this point, they still have the reason for the revocation outstanding. They have a new, more serious, ticket, and they have to pay reinstatement fees with the DMV to get their license back, assuming they are able to clear up the reason for the revocation. Oh yeah, if you plead guilty to driving while license revoked, your license will be suspended automatically for 1 year for your first offense or even longer if it's not your first offense. Generally, people will not come to me, defense attorney, until they are already charged with driving while license revoked because that is when they realize how screwed they are. the good news is, I have talked to some officers about these driving while license revoked tickets who don't care about the offense, they just want to see the client get their license back. So, they will either tell the DA they don't want it prosecuted or just get it set on a court date when the officer won't be there so I can get it dismissed. It is all about the money. Total fucking racket. How broad the term family member is when it comes to domestic battery. It could include college roommates, adult male brothers who don't live together. No. These people are not what people imagine when they think inescapable abusive relationship. I disagree with anything cannabis related. Unless you're in possession of a ton of it and it's obvious they're selling it to who they're not supposed to. If you have personal use, usually I, and the other good cops, usually just confiscate or make the person destroy it themselves in our presence. Also, not a state law, but we have a $500 impound fee that we're forced to enforce on impound related to driving with a suspended/revoked license and possession of cannabis. Generally, that means we're taking a vehicle from someone that can't afford to get their license back and holding their vehicle hostage while it accrues more daily fees. 9 times out of 10 these people are decent folks who are just trying to get their kids to school or go to work. There's only a few people on our department who like impounding vehicles under this ordinance because the admin likes it. Everyone else sees it for what it is. A giant money grab. The amount of bots in this thread is ridiculous. Worked for a city station in Australia that fully expected that we would give tickets to people for being homeless or begging for money. These tickets were $600 at least. I pretty much refused to give them out because it felt barbaric. Like homeless people didn't already have it rough enough without getting a $600 ticket, which if they didn't pay would turn into a court case/warrant. How were they gonna pay it anyway? The only point to it seemed to be to kick them while they were down. Plus, begging for money is a summary offense here, not an indictable offense, and we have discretion for summary offenses, meaning the superior officers wanted us to be jackasses for the sake of it. I was in charge of training new recruits at the time and I thought it was better to demonstrate compassion to them and teach them what services were available to the homeless and when, how to get them fast-tracked into emergency housing and what places would offer free food. I transitioned out of that station because I was tired of getting shit for not giving people shit. Cops in my town carry nickels and feed the meters instead of taking the time to write tickets. I was working security for a low-income housing facility. The people that ran this facility had a little scam they did where they would turn off the FOBS of tenants so tenants couldn't open the front door. It was $35 to get the fob turned back on. There were 400 tenants at this complex. At any one time a quarter of the FOBS might be turned off. I was working the front desk and if a tenant had a turned off fob I wasn't supposed to let them. I would let them in anyway. I got fired. Was an Air Force cop. Hated taking cell phones from people from the flight line. It was an arrest offense and could lose ranks and stuff. Every single cop has their phone on them on the flight line. I guarantee it. Open liquor laws. You wanna have a beer while you float down the river? Have at ER. Gonna throw that beer bottle over the side into the stream. Damn right I'm gonna write you up for littering. And then the open liquor ticket as a fuck you for being a selfish ass. Edit. As was pointed out I should clarify. Floating downstream on an inflatable tube. Not drinking while operating a boat, that still gets you charges. Personal marijuana use. Who the fuck cares? I'll arrest a dealer. But not users. Course I don't really patrol anymore. I train. Blinkers, tint, loud sound systems, I don't care about. Now if you are being a dick, it is game on for all of those things. Ha ha ha. Don't be a dick. When I was a police officer I hated marijuana laws. I would just tell the person to dump it on the ground when I found it. I did the same when I'd find underage kids with alcohol, dump it out and be on your way. Aside from that I pretty much never wrote tickets for equipment violations such as a headlight out, etc. I would just politely let the person know they needed to fix it. Lastly, I would rarely write tickets for expired registration, especially when the person was clearly struggling financially. I couldn't sleep at night knowing I had basically punished someone whose only crime was being poor. My dad was a cop, MP, specifically. He thought banning radar detectors was dumb. His reasoning was because you are trying to get people to slow down and a speeding ticket was a result of people not slowing down. Ticketing for using a radar detector is just ticketing to give out tickets, as radar detectors make people slow down. And #X200B. Edit, I get it, guys. I was just answering the question. I didn't say I agreed with it or that my dad really thought it through. One guy I work with left his PD after 19 years because he got sick of the justice system's handling of drug abusers/dealers. Basically they'd get arrested, then they'd get bailed out for like $40. Then they'd take a plea deal which would be like a $500 fine and a drug rehab class. When they didn't go to the class, which they almost never did, they'd get a warrant on them and the cycle would start again. Basically the justice system doesn't care about drug use. Long ago the people voted for someone who thought that jail would make a good rehab and it doesn't, and these folks get stuck in an endless loop of fines and fees and police interaction and nothing gets done except the judge making their six-figure salary. It's all a game and nobody is taking serious steps to curb the drug problem in the US. And the officers have to keep arresting the same person, over and over again until that person either finds their own way out of abuse or overdoses. Plus drugs do crazy things and the officers are put in constant danger for seemingly no reason. There's a policy in the province that I work that basically says if you're called to a domestic you have to arrest and charge someone. So you basically have to pick who the main aggressor was and arrest/charge/tell them they can't go home. A lot of times there's no injuries or evidence that anything even happened, so it puts you in a difficult spot. Also, I dislike pulling people over and giving tickets. If I see something awful, I'd be compelled to give a warning. The tickets where I work are just too expensive for the average person. Homelessness. We would get so many calls of transients in certain areas. Most are just laying in the sun on the grass, not bothering anyone. But all it takes is a phone call from a board commissioner or someone in power and we'd get a call to tell them to move. We all hated it. Seat belt tickets. I'm sure this is not a popular one, but if you don't like wearing your seat belt while driving, I could care less. If you want a new face, that's on you. Marijuana. Smoke it all you want, just don't drive. Fishing license. Nuff said.